The Vietnam War, an intricate conflict that stretched over 2 decades, drastically reshaped global politics. It all began with the French colonization of Vietnam, a Southeast Asian nation rich in culture and history. The French grip on Vietnam sparked a fierce yearning for independence among the Vietnamese people, leading to the First Indochina War fought from 1946 to 1954 against the communist-led Viet Minh. This war, led by the iconic Ho Chi Minh, was a battle for freedom from French rule and a struggle for a united, independent Vietnam. However, the war concluded with the 1954 Geneva Accords, but rather than uniting Vietnam, it divided the nation at the 17th parallel. The North fell under communist control, while the South came under a US-backed government. This division ignited a powder keg of political, ideological, and military tensions. The division of Vietnam set the stage for a conflict that would entangle the world's superpowers in a brutal and protracted war. The United States, with its policy of containment, stepped into the fray, marking the escalation of the Vietnam War. As the Cold War raged on, the United States perceived the rise of communism in the East as a direct threat to its global interests. Vietnam, divided and ripe with conflict, provided the perfect stage for this ideological battle. The trigger for American involvement came with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. It was here, in the international waters off the coast of North Vietnam, that 2 U.S. destroyers reported being attacked by North Vietnamese naval vessels. While there has been debate over the years about the exact nature and circumstances of these alleged attacks, the incident served as a catalyst for a major shift in American policy. In response to the incident, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a significant piece of legislation that effectively handed over the reins of war to President Lyndon B. Johnson. The resolution gave the president the power to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This marked the beginning of large-scale American involvement in Vietnam. The United States quickly ramped up its military presence. Troops were deployed, naval blockades enforced, and an extensive bombing campaign, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, was initiated. The American strategy was one of attrition, aiming to wear down the enemy through superior firepower and resources. However, the dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain of Vietnam proved challenging, and the North Vietnamese forces, aided by the Viet Cong guerrillas in the south, proved to be a formidable adversary. The American involvement in Vietnam was not without controversy. Back home, the public was divided. The draft, the rising body count, and the lack of a clear endgame led to widespread protests and a growing anti-war movement. Yet, the war machine rolled on, marking a period of escalation that would forever shape the course of the conflict. The full-scale entry of the United States into the conflict marked a new phase in the war, transforming it into a theater of the Cold War. The war's nature, marked by guerrilla warfare and shifting front lines, led to a turning point in public opinion. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was a crucial moment in the Vietnam War. In a series of surprise attacks, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces targeted more than 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam during the Lunar New Year celebrations. While the offensive was militarily unsuccessful for the communists, it was a psychological victory, shattering the American public's confidence in the war effort and marking a shift in public sentiment. Meanwhile, the horrors of war were further exposed in the My Lai massacre, a dark chapter in this conflict. In March of 1968, American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, in the hamlets of My Lai and My Khe. The incident, initially covered up, sparked international outrage when it came to light and further fueled opposition to the war. Back home in the United States, the anti-war sentiment was growing. The draft, which saw young men conscripted into military service, became a contentious issue. Protests erupted across the nation, with demonstrators demanding an end to the war and the return of American troops. This sentiment echoed around the world, with international protests and demonstrations taking place, further isolating the United States on the global stage. The war, once seen as a necessary fight against communism, was now increasingly viewed as a tragic and costly mistake. The human cost was enormous, with casualties mounting on all sides. The conflict had become a quagmire, with no clear end in sight. As the tide of public opinion turned, so too did the course of the war, setting the stage for a new chapter in this protracted and complex conflict. The war, once seen as a necessary fight against communism, was now increasingly viewed as a tragic and costly mistake. As the anti-war movement gained momentum, efforts were made to de-escalate the conflict and bring American troops home. In the face of growing opposition, President Richard Nixon's administration devised a strategy known as Vietnamization. This policy aimed to gradually shift the burden of the war from American to South Vietnamese forces, enabling a steady withdrawal of U.S. military personnel. Vietnamization was not merely about troop numbers. It also involved bolstering the South Vietnamese army with training, equipment, and support to ensure they could stand against the communist forces. Simultaneously, Nixon sought to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the conflict with the North Vietnamese government and its allies. These efforts culminated in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, a landmark agreement aimed at ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Under the accords, the United States agreed to withdraw all remaining combat troops and advisors, while North Vietnam agreed to return all American prisoners of war. Despite the formal end of American involvement, however, the accords did not bring an end to the fighting. The North and South continued to clash, each seeking to assert control over the entirety of Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army, despite the measures of Vietnamization, struggled to hold its ground against the persistent communist forces. Then, in early 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive. The South's defenses crumbled under the onslaught, and by late April, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. On April 30th, Saigon fell. The last American diplomats were hastily evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the U.S. Embassy, in a scene that would become one of the most iconic images of the war. The communist forces of North Vietnam had achieved their goal, the reunification of Vietnam under a single communist government. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, a conflict that forever changed the geopolitical landscape, leaving a lasting impact on all those involved. The Vietnam War, one of the longest and most divisive conflicts of the 20th century, left a profound impact. It took an immense human toll, claiming millions of Vietnamese lives and tens of thousands of American and Allied forces. It reshaped global politics, military strategies, and public perception of war. The conflict ignited debates on the ethics and consequences of interventionist foreign policies that continue today. The Vietnam War, a stark reminder of the costs of ideological conflict, remains a pivotal chapter in global history, its lessons echoing into the present day.